I see you. How are you, sir?
Hello, Nicholas. Nice to see you.
That's Sean. He's the one who brought the thing over to her house. All right. Now, if you want to get back and just see the speaker.
You guys say, you tell me, Sean, if you're ready for me to go, or what, if you're doing some introductions, or what you'd like me to do.
Well, you've got 14 participants so far, Sean, so you tell me when you think you're ready.
Yeah, I think we just give it just a minute. We're pretty close.
Great.
Yep. Let more people sign in. I'm sure a lot of people have a little issue with this. It's a new age type of situation. So
Right.
I think the last couple of times we've waited till almost 4:10.
Oh, that's
so
okay.
It's no problem on this end. I'll mute my mic, but I'll be sitting here listening, and you just let me know, and I'll happily kick in.
That's great. Thanks, Nick. Sean, you got a message from Diane Banks. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, she said she has not received her beer yet.
Make my screen smaller for this thing, because otherwise it looks like this.
I'm going to leave for just a second, Sean.
What will line do? Just minimizes it completely.
And come help me put these dishes away.
While there's folks just sitting here, if there's some questions or anything that I could happily help with, I'd be happy to do so. So if somebody's sitting here staring at each other and you guys wanted to ask a question, please feel free.
But they're not supposed to sneak sips, right, Nick?
No, we can't be tasting yet. Just simple questions. Simple questions.
How do you select the different beers that you choose to highlight in your tasting?
It to go. Like put
You know, it's always an interesting situation in the state of Colorado because there are so many different microbreweries. We are getting to the point where there is way more ability to select something than anything else in almost any other state, and that's a pretty interesting thing to say because Washington and Oregon and New York and a couple of other places, Michigan, these locations have really expanded their microbrew industry. But here in the state of Colorado, we have a unbelievable amount. The numbers change on a regular basis, and the coronavirus has certainly affected some of them. But last record for Colorado that I have seen was in 2019. We had around 300 different microbreweries that were registered with the state. So the way that I choose it is I go off of teaching principles, and I go off of the ability to talk about different styles of beers. And so the different levels that we go through are different processing that happens while making a specific beer. And so the choices that I made today were just going from a very light lager all the way up to a coffee stout. And so we're just going to be looking at different stages of beer and ale and stout production. And that's basically the way that I chose this 4 lineup. And honestly, there is no right or wrong. We are a state that is expanding more and more with this industry, and I'm capitalizing on it myself. Not only am I a master wine and spirits educator, but I also grow hops for a living, and I grow hops for the beer industry here in the state of Colorado. So I'm proud to always be a part of this as well. And I have sold hops to different breweries throughout the state of Colorado and hope to continue to do so. So I support local Colorado. I'm born and raised here in Colorado. I've spent a lot of time out of country and out of state, but I have made my way back here. And when I see these new kinds of beers that are being put out, it's a pleasure to be part of the education system as well as product supply. I enjoy growing hops. I was born on a farm and my wife was as well. And it's fun for me to get back to some of the roots that we originally looked at. And I enjoy growing things. So.
That's great.
Hey, Nick, I've got a quick question.
Let's
I
hear it.
come from a German area that was where German immigrants came over in the mid-19th century and started small breweries. Would expect that those breweries would have put out in their successes in the last 150 or 200 years would be putting out really excellent beer. But the reality is when you put up their output next to craft beers, it seems like there's no comparison. The craft beers, beat them all hollow. What's your take on that?
And that's a great perspective. And some of those German immigrants that started places, a lot of those that we see are actually down in Mexico. So Pacifico and Modelo and Tecate, these Mexican beers, they were a huge derivative of the German influences during the beginning of the 19th century. And here in the United States, of course, places like Anheuser-Busch and other large corporations that started the understanding of what's known as the Bavarian beer laws. And the Bavarian beer laws have actually been in effect for a very long period of time. And if you are going to be making a specific style of lager or beer, you'd be following a specific protocol that's using only 4 ingredients, and that's water, hops, yeast, and barley. And so as we look at those specific ingredients, each location on the planet has adapted different styles, how much we toast our grain, which yeast strand we're using. And as we see the larger companies like the Bohemia of Mexico, which is a very famous German brewery that's producing a wonderful Mexican lager, they stick to a traditional Bohemian understanding of it. And when we start looking at microbreweries, they do a lot of other things. They implement different types of ingredients. They do different types of styles. And because of that, they hit a large demographic of people. So
the silver one did.
Thank you.
No problem. It's my pleasure.
Hey, Sean.
Sean, how we looking, sir?
Yeah, I think we can go ahead and get started. I know Diana's got a package of beer that should be there any minute. So that was her question. And I think you can go ahead and at least get started with the group. And Louise, if you can just make sure that you're keeping people on mute, that would be huge.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. So don't take offense if you unmute yourself. I may mute you if I'm picking up a lot of background noise, but so just check your mute button to make sure you're audible. And with no further ado, Nicolas Post, take it away.
I greatly appreciate that, you guys. And for all of those that haven't been witness to one of these tastings yet, I try to give a little introduction. I'll start here. I'm kind of going to drag my feet to make sure that we get a couple more of these people that need their beers and are signing in. But I introduce myself, and then on each of our beers, I'll do an introduction and an explanation, and then we try to just give a couple of minutes for open questions. And that can become a little bit difficult with our mute buttons. If your picture isn't there, I can't see you raise your hand, or we can't be able to do that. So if you are really interested in asking a question, please make sure that when that time comes to raise your hand or to click the unmute button, please. And to just start off, to introduce myself, my name is Nicolas Post. I'm a Master Wine and Spirits educator. I got my master's through the International Wine and Spirits Guild. It is a state certified master's education program, so I'm capable of teaching to college level and above. We do some very intense professional programs, but I also do a lot of public education, like what we do here at Balfour. I am going now on over 10 years of teaching classes here at Balfour, and we have such a great relationship. And for those that are looking to actually join with Balfour, do know that this wonderful organization has gotten me my not only first but second vaccinations for COVID, and I will be teaching in person in the Louisville location on the 24th of March. And so after almost a year of not being in person and having to wear these silly things and speak into the computer, I'm looking forward to that. But as what we're doing this forum for, as an understanding of kind of getting to know Balfour a little bit, it's going to be fine to continue this. We're getting better at it, and for us to be able to reach out to a larger group of people, it's a pleasure. I actually got my start in education after doing 6 years with the 173rd Military. And yes, ma'am, do you have a question?
Nick, I just wanted to say that just for those of you who are not Balfour residents, which is probably most of you, Nick has probably taught enough classes at Balfour that our residents could be certified at this point. So that's how popular Nick is with his tasting events at Balfour.
It's fun, and I've made some wonderful friends, and it's been a great journey. And I teach, as I said, professionally as well as publicly, and one of my absolute favorite things to do is to be here with Balfour. The residents have been wonderful, staff is wonderful. So without further ado, let's take a little look at some beers. I watch my clock on the top of the computer here, and I try to keep each beer right around 10 to 15 minutes with questions involved. And we'll probably run this as long as the Zoom meeting doesn't end on us, and I don't think it will, but we'll probably go until a little after 5 o'clock because we started a little late. So with that, we're going to start looking at 4 Colorado microbrews. And for those that weren't involved with the first couple of conversations that I was having just as banter amongst people here, brewing beer is a fascinating aspect, and one of the most interesting things is that its origins come from serendipity. There wasn't necessarily a single person that discovered fermentation in alcohol or discovered fermentation into an ale. It was an accident, and it's all because yeast is a fungus that is almost everywhere on planet Earth, and once you expose yeast to sugar, fermentation is going to occur. When we look at some of the origins of beer production, we call it ale because ale is what's known as a warm fermentation, top down. And so that means that yeast will settle on top of something, and if the temperature is correct, it floats through and it ferments those sugars, similar to what we would do with making a bread. As we progress through the years, and just so you know, our first origins of beer production can date back over 12,000 years. And so as we progress, the next evolution in beer production actually won't be until the age of exploration, when we start to get new yeast strands from the new world, and we can start to do a different type of fermentation using different yeasts. And that process would create things like beer and lager and pilsners. And so as we go through, we'll talk a little bit about the styles. The first one that we're going to be looking at is a beer from a Denver company called Post. And Post has been around now for over 15 years, and they've done an excellent job of staying on the market. One of the main things that we do as educators or as professionals in the industry is to see the marketability and the longevity of a specific product. And this company's been around for quite a while. They've done a good job. They've showcased a lot of interesting styles. And the first one that we're going to be looking at is the traditional Pilsner. Pilsner style is that understanding of a very light, carbonated, not overly toasted grain. And so as you open this, and it's okay to enjoy a little on the side, but try to keep your pours to about 2 ounces, which in a glass is going to be just about a third, just depending upon the size of your glass. If you guys are using goblets out there, it might take you a little longer to get through those 2 ounces, but just get a nice pour to the point where you can see the carbon dioxide and you can see the color. The color is the most important thing because that's the idea of understanding the specific style of a beer. And as we look at this, you can see that it's very golden, it's very light. And the reason for that is because the grain that's being used, the barley, is only being toasted to a certain amount. And I believe the easiest way for me to ever explain this understanding is the simplicity of toasting a piece of toast. If you put a piece of bread into the toaster and you only put it on one, and if you didn't know this, toasters mean how many minutes it's going to be in there. So it sits for 1 minute and the bread comes out and it's lightly golden. And if you turned it all the way up to 6, it'd come out and it'd be black, and you'd have this very dark color. Well, there's everything in between there as well. And the same thing works with beers. We just simply toast the grain to a specific color, and that color is going to give us a specific taste profile and an understanding of what ingredients were being used. As I originally talked about, the 4 original ingredients for a Bavarian beer law would be barley, yeast, water, and hops. Hops being the preservative, barley being the cereal grain that we're using, and then water and yeast being the fermentation process. This is a very light colored Pilsner, and that Pilsner understanding is along the lines of that new world yeast fermentation. Everything prior to the age of exploration, we were using a yeast strand that was predominantly European and Asian. And those yeast strands only had the ability to ferment beers to a fairly low alcohol content, and it was a specific process. Same thing as I had mentioned before about making bread. When we get yeast strands from the New World after the age of exploration, these yeast strands had the ability to actually ferment at a faster pace, and they enjoyed what's called cold temperature. And so a beer or a Pilsner or a lager is called a cold fermentation bottom up, and an ale or a stout would be considered a warm fermentation top down. With that being said, give this a nice smell, give it a couple of really good tastes, see if you can identify or at least appreciate how light on style it is. More than anything, this is going to be a microbrew's understanding of what something like a traditional Budweiser or a traditional Coors is looking like. And as Sean had mentioned before, or excuse me if it was somebody else that was talking about what separates out this style of beer from a simple Budweiser, the concentration of ingredients is very important. And in almost anything that we're talking about, from culinary arts to the understanding of producing beers, the better ingredients that you use, the more concentration of those ingredients that you use, the more structured that product can be. And so microbreweries have the ability of not having to stretch out the ingredients quite as much, which can give a whole lot more concentration. And that concentration is typically perceived as something that's a little bit more advanced than your typical Budweiser or your Coors. So with that being said, give it a smell, give it a taste, and I will open it up for any questions or comments on our first little tasting here. What do you guys think? And as we will see, and as we will go through and progress, especially if you come to Balfour, it typically takes 1 or 2 drinks before people loosen up and they start to feel ready to ask questions. But so you know, I've been an educator for over 10 years. I'm actually going on my 12th year of as an educator, and there's a very few questions that I won't at the very least have a half answer to, and I'll tell you if it's only a half answer, but most of the time I can answer almost any question. This has been my solid profession for quite a while now, and I enjoy it a great deal. I spent a lot of time in the military, and I've traveled to over 52 different countries, and I've done that not only through the military, but also in exploration of understanding different alcoholic beverages, primarily wine and spirits, but also beers as well. So I'm comfortable with almost any question, and more than anything, I just want you guys to have a good time and feel like you're getting at everything you need out of this. All right, it's quiet out
Nick,
there. That's all right.
Nick, I have a question. So I wonder, as you go along, can you talk about temperature serving suggestions for each of the different types as you go through the tasting, and what you would recommend?
Absolutely. And that's a great question. And the good news behind it is, in comparison to wine and even spirits, where people can get a little confused and frustrated with the service temperature, Pilsners, beers, and lagers are cold fermentation, which, as I was talking about, is this bottom-up New World understanding. Anything that goes through cold fermentation likes to be served cold. Anything that goes through a warm fermentation likes to be served more at what's called cellar temperature. And cellar temperature is typically between 55 and 60 degrees. In a traditional German brew house, or in a Bavarian understanding of what a cellar interprets, you can see fluctuations as low as 50 degrees and all the way up to 65. And so there is quite a bit, and that would be for your Guinnesses, your stouts, your porters, and as the one that we're looking at today, the coffee stout, it's last in line because it is the biggest on the palate. And a lot of times when we're talking about even foods or beverages, when something is heavy on the palate, the warmer it is, kind of the more chewy it is. And when you want something to be refreshing and you want something to be crisp, you want it to be cold. So in a long roundabout way of understanding this, if it's a crisp beer, lager, or a Pilsner, you want it to be crisp and refreshing, therefore cold. If it's an ale or a porter or a stout, you want it to be what's known as cellar temperature. That does not mean room temperature. you can bring these beers down to 50 degrees. And a typical refrigerator is between 36 and 42, hopefully no more than 42. But what you can easily do is you can put a stout or a porter into the refrigerator for 20 minutes and take it out, and you can do specific tests. But as a simple understanding, think of that simplicity of the fermentation process. If it's a warm fermentation, meaning it's an ale or it's a stout or a porter, serve it a little warmer. And if it's a Pilsner or a beer or a lager, serve it as cold as you can get it, honestly. You don't want to get all the way down to freezing, which would be salt water at 32, which gets us down to about 31. But 32 degrees, you know, again, there's water crystals in beers still, and those will freeze. So you want to be up above about 34, 35 degrees. Your refrigerator is perfect for those. So great question. Anybody else?
And Nicholas, what if you said it? I apologize, I missed it. What is cellar temperature if you put a number on it, give or take? What is that actual temperature?
Cellar temperature would be 55 degrees. If we were going to give it an exact temperature, it'd be 55 degrees. Anything above 50 is okay. What starts to happen below 50 is tartaric acid crystallizes. It's chemistry. And so as fermentation has created a lot of chemistry, when you decrease temperature to a specific amount, specific chemicals start to slow down and bind. And so if we're talking about, again, simple chemistry, heat is fast and molecules move really quickly, and cold temperatures slow down. And so in something that gets too cold, those molecules get too heavy and they fall. So in a simple answer, 55 degrees is about as perfect a cellar temperature. What I do when I design or build a specific cellar, and as long as I stay between 55 and 62, I'm happy. And so right there between 55 and 62 is about the perfect cellar temperature that you'll find in the caves of Belgium, the caves of Luxembourg, the Bay caves of Germany. So that's what you're really looking for. And so again, if you have a wine cooler or a beer fridge, keeping it between 55 and 62 is about perfect for your porters, your ales, and your stouts. All right, let's move into the next one, which is a very fun progression. We're going to be we looked first at that Pilsner, and now what we're going to be looking at is a Belgian style golden strong ale. And this is from Pikes Peak Brewing Company. Again, we're looking only at Colorado beers right now, and Pikes Peak is actually from Monument, Colorado. And as we see the style of Belgian golden strong, realize that the alcohol content is 8.7, which is a fairly hefty amount for a specific type of ale. And the fact that, as we just got done talking about beers, pilsners, and lagers, and then the difference between ales, this is an ale. This is a top-down fermentation. Now, does that mean that if this is at refrigeration temperature, you're doing something wrong? Absolutely not. When doing technical tasting, when doing an evaluation of tastings, specific temperatures can play minute roles. For a broad spectrum tasting like we're doing today, you're going to get the same types of evaluations that anybody else is going to get if this was served at 55 degrees versus if it was 40 or 45, what it's probably at if you were to take it out of the refrigerator. And the reason behind that is that we're not here to do chemical evaluation on the palate. We're here to take a look at the smells and tastes that are associated with specific styles. So if you had all these in the refrigerator, not a problem. And as we look at this ale, realize that it is that oldest of styled of production when it comes to a specific beer. And it's an interesting term because we're so associated with talking about beers when in actuality, the oldest of our alcoholic beverages in the cereal grain industry would be considered an ale. The oldest alcoholic beverage in the world is mead, and mead is a derivative of honey. And so as we look back, we can see that the production of mead in ancient Asia and specific locations throughout the Eurasia or the Fertile Crest, which is kind of where civilization started, similar to where local Iran would be today. It's a it's an interesting conversation all in itself, but at the end of the day, that's where we will see the production of ales. And the story behind it that we like to give, just to give a little bit of a understanding of how that serendipity happened. We talk about a mother telling her kids to go out to the field and harvest some barley grain to make bread. And those kids go out and harvest barley grain, and they get preoccupied and they leave the pot of barley sitting there on the path, and it rains and it fills up with water. And the next day the kids go home, or the kids went home that night and mom didn't think anything of it. And then the next day was asked, well, what happened to the grain? And they go running out there. And because it had gotten moist and because the grains had cracked, natural fermentation occurred. And there was actually fermentation that was happening during the process. You can see the little bubbles, just like when you're making bread, you'll see the carbon dioxide releasing as the bread is becoming to rise. And beer and ale and stouts and lagers and all the different styles that we're talking about, fermentation is still the key. And fermentation's byproduct is carbon dioxide. And so as fermentation occurs, it doesn't matter if it's in bread or if it's in a grain or if it's in a grape, it's going to produce a bubble. And so you would have been able to see, hey, mom, look, this pot of barley is bubbling. And that would be the understanding of the first aspect of alcohol. And that's where ales would come. So with that, let's take a look at this monument, which is, of course, just right down the road here on I-25, Pikes Peak Brewing Company, Belgian style golden strong ale. You'll see, of course, a little bit more color as we look at a toasted grain, and I didn't leave quite enough in the original, but you will see just a slight difference. And if you have a little left over from our first Pilsner in front of you, you'll see just a little thicker of a golden hue in this. And the reason for that is the stylistic understanding of golden. And as we're looking at toasting the grain, it's along the exact same lines as I had originally talked about. Instead of turning the toaster to 1, I turned the toaster to 1.5. And the barley that I was using to make this golden Belgian style ale, I simply toasted a little bit more. And what happens with that is exactly the same things that happen if we toast a piece of bread. A lightly toasted piece of bread just is like a piece of bread. Might have a little bit of texture to it. But as we get to a burnt piece of bread, it becomes bitter and it becomes astringent. And then there's, of course, everything in between, from a lightly toasted grain all the way to a heavily toasted grain. You get those caramel notes, you get those vanilla notes, you get these coconut notes. And we're not quite there yet with a golden style ale, but what you will start to get is a little bit more of the cereal grain. And it'll be also not only on the nose, but it'll be on the palate. And as we smell this, you can actually tell that there's a bit more alcohol to it. It tingles and tickles your nose just a little bit. And you can also tell that the grain is just a little bit more intense. You can smell more cereal. And as we taste through different beers and lagers and stouts, you are smelling cereal. That's what it is. It's a specific kind of cereal. It could be just barley, or it could be barley and wheat, or it could be barley and wheat and sorghum, or it could be barley, wheat, sorghum, rice. It can be barley, wheat, sorghum, rice, corn. Almost any kind of grain that we're talking about, we can steep, expose the carbohydrates, which is a sugar, and ferment into a specific type of beer or ale. And so with that, this is a very fun one to take a look at, just because of the fact that it does have a little higher alcohol content. The Belgian style is a style that's very indicative of typically having a little higher alcohol content. And the reason behind that is because the yeast strands that the monasteries were using were getting better at fermentation. Our monasteries throughout Europe are the ones that are specifically responsible for the development and the exploration of, in particular, wines and beers and liqueurs. And as we are looking at beers today, there are a lot of tapestry monks and or Cistercian monks throughout the Belgian area and the Luxembourg area and the German area that did nothing other than develop an understanding of which yeast strands to be using to ferment the product and which kinds of cereal grains would work best with specific yeast. And as the Belgian monasteries would work better into these yeast understandings, as yeast got stronger, it could eat more sugar and convert more to alcohol. And so if I only have a little bit of sugar, or if I only have yeast that can consume a little bit of sugar before they die, I can only get a little bit of alcohol. If I make a yeast a lot stronger, and again, a yeast is a fungus. And so just by simply procreating and working with different yeast strains, we can make a stronger kind of fungus that makes more fermentation. And those monasteries were working specifically on that. And that's where we can see these Belgian style golden strong ales. Most of the time when people look at a beer list or they walk into a liquor store, they read what's on the label. Okay, this is a microbrew. It says Pikes Peak Brewing, golden, strong, Belgian style golden strong ale. And it's like, I don't know what all that means. Well, hopefully just by simply listening to an understanding of what they're telling you, they're specifically talking about how the product is made. It's Belgian style. Means that it's got a higher alcohol content and it's a derivative of a Tapas monk. The golden means that they toasted the grain to a golden color. That simple. And then of course, strong ale, telling you that it's a little higher in alcohol content and that it is a top-down fermentation, the ale. And so all the words that are on the can are just simply talking about how the product was made. I really enjoy the smell of this. As you should have picked up by now, do realize this is almost 9% alcohol, and so go easy on consuming this. Try to stick with your tasting pours until after the class, and then you guys can pour which ones you like, but this is a little higher alcohol content. If you think about a traditional beer or Pilsner, they're between 4 and 5% alcohol. This is almost twice that, if not a little bit more. And so just keep that in mind, and with that, go ahead and give it some smells and tastes and let me know what you think or if you have any questions. You guys happy with this one? You see the creamy note on the palate? One of my favorite things about a good ale is that it has a concentration of lactic acid. Lactic acid is the acid that's prevalent in cream and dairy or cheese, and it means that it sticks easily to your palate. And ales are very, very much so a derivative of lactic acid fermentation. And so it's heavier on the palate. From the Pilsner that we had before that was crisp and light and refreshing. This has got something that's a little bit more tangible. It's a little more chewable. It's an actual product that lingers on the palate. And that's that ale process, the understanding of the warm fermentation, creating more of the cereal grains into it. So I really enjoy these. I think that this is kind of where we start to get the tastes of specific ales, stouts, porters. I'm a huge fan of Pilsners and lagers and beers, but their invention is to be crisp and light and refreshing and to kind of just be able to consume. Ales and stouts and porters are about the taste. They're about what it feels like on the mouth, and it's more about what's in the glass. So a little bit more interesting, a little bit more to talk about than your typical beers and Pilsners. I see a lot of microbreweries and of course the larger companies as well. If you think about their light beer, or if you think about just their simple Pilsner, they're all very similar. There's no real major variance. Yes, some people like Coors Light over Bud Light and Michelob over, yes, of course. But at the end of the day, they're all pretty similar. They're all in the same ring. They're all in the same taste profile. And it's when you get into these microbreweries that are looking at these golden ales and things like that, that it becomes a little bit more unique and a little bit more interesting. And I appreciate this. Any questions, any comments or concerns? All right. You guys are quiet. I'm impressed. Most of the time it gets pretty noisy with questions, but we'll continue on and maybe we'll get some interesting ones on this next one, considering that it is the wonderful month of March, and our next in our lineup is going to be an Irish Red. I have absolutely no Irish running through my body, but I feel it in March, and I do corned beef and cabbage, and I drink red beers, and I drink Jameson, and it is what it is, but I enjoy almost all cultural aspects of this wonderful month. And I very much so love a good Irish red. And just as we got done talking about in terms of stylistic production, the whole purpose of it is to create a specific color profile. Now, as Irish reds will typically have more of those brown notes, and my color is being lost in the sunlight here, but it is to derive some of those pinkish reddish hues. And so as we're starting to talk about toasting specific grains, you'll typically see barley as the principal cereal grain. And barley actually reaches a brownish red tone known as brick red. And brick red is a characteristic of Irish ales. And so as we're talking about the progression or the cultural movement of ales and stouts throughout Europe, as we talk about a German Pilsner, or if we talk about a Belgian ale, by the time that we get over to the cultural understandings of an Irish red, it's all about how much they toast the grain. And for a cultural understanding to them, they toasted the grain to this brick red. Now, given this is brewed in Fort Collins, Colorado by Max Line Brewing, but the understanding and the stylistic structure of how to make this product has always been the same. And as we look at the different styles or the structures of specific beer or stouts and ales, Irish red is one that typically has a sweeter tone to it. And so as we talk about Newcastle is a brown ale, and it's typical of a sweet tasting ale. Irish red is just the step before that. So if you're familiar with some of those brown ales, you'll know that they're reaching that Newcastle sweetness level, something that's similar to a molasses. Irish reds are just right before that. And what happens is it creates this kind of caramel taste. It creates a caramel note on the nose, and it creates a caramel taste on the palate. And as we've continued to progress, I'm only using 2 glasses here, but you will have seen that from the Pilsner being a very light color to the golden ale being a bit more of that golden characteristic, and then the Irish red, the only thing that we're doing is increasing the temperature of the toast on that grain. And so as we are looking at moving through the different styles, most of the understanding comes from how much we're toasting it. Yes, we're going to, in the Sad Panda, our last one, and even in the Irish red, you will start to see some people not just using the Bulgarian 4, meaning water, hops, barley, and yeast. They will start to use things like wheat and rye and sorghum and rice and corn. There's lots of cereal grains. So they're kind of stepping out of that Bulgarian understanding, and to do that, they're creating different tastes and smells and profiles. Now, this specific Irish red actually is living along the lines of the Bulgarian understanding, which is just the barley. And as we see that, it shouldn't have as much of a sweet tone as you would get from, say, as a Newcastle, which will be one step further. I really enjoy the decrease of carbon dioxide that you typically see as our ales get bigger. And so as we are tasting through our lineup, you'll see that the carbon dioxide in the Pilsner and then the carbon dioxide in the Golden Stout, they were there, but they were a lot higher than what we're looking at in, say, the Irish red, or when we get to the Sad Panda. When we start to talk about things like Guinness, Guinness is a nitrogen infused product, which means that when you crack the lid, a little bubble of nitrogen creates the foam that's present in the alcohol. Carbon dioxide is a natural occurring entity in most properly made fermented beverages. Now, yes, we can simulate carbon dioxide and you can put it into things like Coors Light. And what ends up happening there is it's a different type of carbon dioxide. It reacts slightly differently, and we won't get too much into that. But at the end of the day, let's just say that natural carbon dioxide is something that works better with your body. And as we progress into heavier toasted grains, you'll see that the carbon dioxide doesn't have as much of a blast. And the reason for it is simple. This is a thicker product. Carbon dioxide doesn't have the ability to get through it as quickly. And so with that, it's typically a little bit heavier on the palate than light and refreshing. If you think about a simple, well, our first one, that Pilsner had the bubbles on it. And this one has kind of a tingle. It's not quite as much of a bubble like a glass of champagne would have. That helps carry the product. Carbon dioxide is a cleanser to the palate. And so something that has a lot of CO2 to it makes it so that after you take a sip, it's there for a second and then it disappears. And what do you want again? Another sip of it, because it's quick on the palate. Things that have less carbon dioxide linger And so the smells and the taste, they stay more on the palate, and it takes longer for it to go away, which means that you're not looking to take this Irish ale and sip it and sip it and sip it and sip it and sip it. You want to have it to the point where you take a smell and you take a taste, and it kind of lingers on the mouth. And that's something that's very unique and very quintessential to the ale stout lager or ale stout porter understanding. And so with that, you'll see that this is a little bit less bubbly. And I do know a lot of folks that prefer heavier beers because carbon dioxide makes them burp and it gives them indigestion and things like that. And so as we move into the last two here, you will see quite a decrease in that CO2, which is a lot easier to work with, if you will, on the human body. It's not as much bubbles. Bubbles are great to cleanse the palate, and in the wine industry and the natural fermentation of lagers and pilsners and beers, it works well to keep it crisp. It also makes it so that you want to drink more of them. And so if you've got a 4% alcohol pilsner beer or lager, you drink it and you want another one, you want another one. And as you're looking at something like this that has 6.5 or 6.2% alcohol, it also has a whole lot more flavor to it. Those cereal grains, that toasted barley that tastes like caramel, is very present on the palate. And the more that you keep it there, the more uniqueness that comes through. The whole principle of understanding smell and taste comes from a location in our brain that's known as the hippocampus and the hypothalamus. It's also the location where memories are at. And the reason for that is if you don't have a memory for a specific smell and taste, then you can't name that specific smell or taste. I use this a lot in the wine industry because if I'm explaining a lot about the things that I'm smelling in a specific glass, a lot of people will be like, oh yeah, I smell that, I smell that, I smell that. And you don't necessarily need to do that because each one of us has our own specific smells and our own specific memories. And so to me, what I might smell doesn't necessarily mean something that you would smell. And where I go with that is if I say that I smell lychee nut on something and you've never smelled lychee nut before, then you wouldn't be able to say, I smell lychee nut. And it's because you don't have a memory for it. And so you have to develop a memory for that specific smell and a memory for that specific taste before you can say the name of the smell or you can say the name of the taste. And all that takes is just muscle memory. And what's fun to me about doing specific tastings is I will get a lot of people that say, oh, I know that smell. What is that? What is that? I know that smell. What is that? And the reason for that is because most of our lives, when we smell something, we don't say it out loud. If you walk into a room and you smell something, you don't instantly say the name of the smell. And some of the more easy ones that we talk about, if you pick up an orange and you smell an orange, you don't say orange. And a lot of times that link in our brain and the synapses of our understanding makes it so that when you smell orange in something, because you're so used to not saying it, it's like, oh, I know that smell. I've smelled that 100 times. I know that smell. What is that? And you just have to work with muscle memory. So though it sounds weird, what I teach my professional students to do is to actually go through culinary arts and to go through the grocery store, and as they smell specific products, to actually say it out of their mouth. Because that link of being able to link it from your nose to your brain to your mouth, it fixes that. I know that smell. What is that? I know that smell. I've smelled that before. And so that's one of the better ways to get people to learn how to work with their nose and to work with their sense of smell. With that being said, are there any questions, comments, or concerns with our Irish Red Ale out of Fort Collins, Colorado?
Nick,
Still quiet out there.
I don't have a list of breweries, and I didn't hear what brewery that is in Fort Collins. Would you repeat that?
Yes, sir. This is Max Line Brewing, which is, if you're in the Fort Collins area, Max Line, MAXLINE. And it's right over by the Fort Collins Airport. Okay. Yep. A great location. I was born and raised in Fort Collins. Their microbrew industry has done exceptionally well. And to see some of these companies that are continuing to come out, Max Line is a fairly new one. And this is a wonderfully balanced Irish ale. I appreciate it a great deal.
That's great. I was in Fort
Anybody
Collins.
else?
I was in Fort Collins for 31 years. And
what'd you do there, sir?
Sorry, I was in Fort Collins for 31 years, moved down to Pueblo West, so I'm looking out at Pikes Peak, the south part of Pikes Peak, out of my land on the north. So I didn't get.
Well, that's a beautiful view.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I live in the Longmont Boulder area, and today was one of the first days that I could see Pikes Peak quite clearly. It's quite rare anymore that we can look down I-25 and see you, but we could see you today. So, all right, you guys, no other questions or comments on the Irish Red? Everybody's happy and ready to move on to the Sad Panda? It sounds like a horrible name, but I'll tell you, it's one of the most interesting beers that's been out as a microbrew in quite a long time. I am fascinated with this company. It's the Horse and Dragon out of Fort Collins, and they are a really interesting company. I've had the pleasure of meeting the owners. I have had the pleasure of actually sitting in their box for the CSU games. They're huge contributors to the CSU industry and a lot of the things that go on in Fort Collins. And one of my very close family friends is best friends with these guys. So it's fun to talk about them. They've done a good job of succeeding, and no question about it. Our last beer is a stout that is probably their flagship, known as the Sad Panda. It is a coffee stout. It is making its way through the industry faster than we've really seen a lot of other products. New Belgium is one of the largest microbreweries in Fort Collins, and they've done a good job of what's known as becoming world class. When I talk about a specific product, it doesn't matter if it's a spirit or a wine or a beer. When you talk about world class, what that means is that it's sold throughout the world. And so if we talk about something that is sold locally, it's not that it isn't delicious and that we don't all love it, but it can't be considered world class. And it's only considered world class when it's distributed in, at the very least, every state in the United States and maybe a couple of countries. World class, of course, would be that you can go to Hangzhou, China and order a beer. And New Belgium out of Fort Collins is a company that has made it world class. They have a couple of products that are almost everywhere. And if you go to the Tokyo airport, you can get a Fat Tire beer. And Fat Tire is a world-class beer. Sad Panda out of the Horse and Dragon is an up-and-comer, and in my opinion, could easily move into that understanding. They've actually only been around now for less than 10 years, but they've done an exceptional job of making some very, very interesting products. And the Sad Panda is by far one of the more interesting ones. Coffee stout. Now let's just talk about it for a second, because at the end of the day, it's still along the same lines of what we've talked about in the last three beers that we've had. The toast on the grain and the amount that we toast it to gives specific taste profiles and aspects. And as we take barley and we get it to almost burnt, you get these caramel, toffee, coffee tones. Yes, this is an infused product, which means that there is some cocoa bean to it. There is some coffee bean to it, which the cocoa bean and the coffee bean add to the richness. But at the end of the day, the stout character, and I need to get there by having a glass. As we look at the specific color of this product, you can see that it is very much so dark. And that dark category from our last one, which is the ale, the Golden Irish Ale, to a black stout, and you have it in front of you, is a much darker product. Now, as I was talking about when it comes to CO2s, you'll see that when you pour this, you'll typically have a much fatter head, and then it decreases, and then it's no longer there. And the reason for that is because once it's exposed to oxygen, it releases and it's gone. And that's an okay thing, because as we had originally talked about, we kind of want this to linger on the palate. We don't want it to dissipate quickly. The understanding of a Sad Panda coffee stout is to be something that lingers on the mouth, that you taste those coffee and caramel and toffee notes, as well as that it's a little bitter. And I think that that's something that a lot of people have learned to either appreciate or not appreciate. Hops can be bitter. Stouts can be bitter. So is black coffee. And I'm a black coffee drinker. I like espresso. I like black coffee and that sensation. And if you're a tea drinker, black tea with no sugar or honey, that's bitter and astringent. And the more my grandma used to burn toast. She liked to eat burnt toast, and it always fascinated my brother and I when we were growing up because we didn't like burnt toast, but she just liked that taste of bitter. People like that bitter astringent sensation, and if it's not on a piece of something that has been carbonated, and that's the sensual understanding of it. When we talk about food and wine pairings, or food and beer pairings, or food and spirit pairings, I always try to get people to understand that something like this that has those bitter tones pairs very well to things that are bitter. And they say, well, what foods are bitter? Well, if you take any kind of anything and put it on a charcoal grill, doesn't matter if it's a steak or a piece of chicken or a portobello mushroom or a piece of asparagus, it doesn't matter what you put on it. What you're doing is you're carbonizing the specific chemicals on the outside. Most of the time it'll be a protein, but as you carbonize a protein, it becomes bitter and astringent. That's what the char grill is. And so as you char something, you're reaching those bitter, astringent taste profiles. So if you're looking for something to pair things that are dark and bitter and astringent, think along the lines of something that's toasted. And it's not just toast. Now I'm talking about meats and vegetables that we can do. And all you're essentially doing is you're carbonizing an aspect of it, the flesh of it, the flesh of portobello mushroom, the flesh of beef, the flesh of chicken. And that carbon astringent sensation pairs very, very well to things that are slightly bitter. The other, of course, easy understanding is that if you take your coffee black, you'll probably appreciate a beverage like a coffee stout that has those natural tastes, those natural carbons that are a little bit more bitter and astringent. Now, as we look at the traditional style of stouts and porters, you'll see locations like England being at the top of the list of people that were actually taking these grains and pushing them just a little bit further. And as we progress from Germany into Belgium and Luxembourg and moving over to Ireland and then down into England, that understanding of how the grain affects is super interesting. Most products, and a lot of people have a hard time thinking about this if you're a Scotch fan, just realize that the barley that's used in Scotch is actually grown and produced in England. And so if you know all of the civil wars that have occurred throughout history between the Irish and the Scotch and the English, it's kind of sad to think that the Irish and the Scotch industry, Irish whiskeys and the Scotch whiskey industry have derived from the English growing of barley, but it is true. And English barley is considered some of the finest barley in the world. And as we look at some of these styles that are a little bit darker, we'll see them deriving on the UK as of today. Now, as microbrewery industry has expanded, as the internet has taken wildfire, and as we continue to progress as a people, you'll see these styles and these production techniques almost everywhere in the world, from different styles of Japanese beers to different styles of New Zealand beers to different styles of course, American, Canadian. There's not really anywhere in the world where we're not going to see an understanding of microbrewing. It is an understanding of taking, again, simply 4 products and creating an alcoholic beverage off of them. As we look at this, and I just got done teaching a wine class for the lodge at Balfour in Louisville last week for Heart Awareness Month. Moderation is the key in everything, and it doesn't matter what we're talking about. You should always be moderate in the consumption of any alcoholic beverage, in particular when it comes to beers and spirits and wines. And as we look at this, and as we've gone through each one, paying attention to the fact that this one also has almost 7% alcohol, it's a heavier product. And it's not supposed to be consumed at a fast rate. I find it interesting to sit down at a pub or a bar and watch some people just go big beer after big beer after big beer, because that would make my stomach hurt. It's like eating a big chunk of bread followed by a big chunk of bread followed by a big chunk of bread. And yes, the alcohol, of course, helps people and they like that process. But at the end of the day, you should consume things for the purposes of a taste that you appreciate, the specific purposes of a pairing that work well together, or just in a moderate understanding of that I really like this and it should be consumed in a moderate amount. When we take things to extremes is when it becomes unhealthy, and it's an unfortunate thing in my industry I have to deal with, because I teach people about tasting specific alcoholic products, and at the end of the day I'm not looking for anybody to become an alcoholic, and we need to appreciate the amounts that are in these, and this coffee stout is a heavy product. So as we've looked at all 4 of these, do realize that they are a little bit heavier, and drinking 3 or 4 beers that have 7% alcohol is quite an extreme amount. So the good news is that these can also be preserved in the refrigerator and enjoyed tomorrow. And that at the end of the day, it's just about the enjoyment and the pleasure of talking about these products, and hopefully expanding your views and your positions on how you guys feel about this stuff. So with the coffee stout as our last beverage, and we're fortunate to have such a unique company here in Colorado produce such a really fun product, because Sad Panda and this coffee stout has really expanded a lot of the tastes throughout Colorado. We're a little early, but I'll happily listen and take some more questions and or comments. Is anybody interested in talking about the Sad Panda? Please.
Hey,
You're
Nick,
muted. There we go.
Hey, Nick, I just wanted to say that the folks that make Sad Panda are pretty great. My husband used to work for HP, and he organized an all HP campus make your own beer contest. And the folks at is it Horse and Dragon, right? Came out, and their head brewmaster came out.
Horse and Dragon.
Yeah, Horse and Dragon. Yeah, came out and did the evaluation. So I say that because there's so many of these smaller breweries and microbreweries and craft breweries and whatever you want to call them these days that have been so good about taking care of their communities and furthering their craft and sharing their knowledge with a lot of people. And I think that's a big reason why the industry has grown so much, is because of that, connection with the communities that has existed.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. And Horse and Dragon, when I started talking about them, they've made an impact on me as well. I don't often go up to Fort Collins anymore. My mom still lives there, but I just go up and see her, and I don't tour too much around the area. It's gotten quite busy from 40 years ago. I'm getting old. But as I've gone back and forth between Fort Collins, there's no question that Sad Panda has made a mark on the industry. They do different voluntary services, and they put themselves out there to not only be marketable, but also to be helpful to the community. And I'm a huge fan of that. I lived in Italy for almost 6 years, and when I came home, one of the concepts that I couldn't quite grasp that we don't have here in the U.S. is a proper co-op understanding. I know we used to. I know that when we were a big agricultural country, we were very much so into the co-ops and an understanding of helping one another and promoting a specific agricultural growth. And we're slowly getting back to that. But coming from Europe, they're a big co-op location. And when you look at the ways that they make beers and the ways that they make wines, they do it as a helping community and that understanding of what a true co-op is. And I believe that Horse and Dragon is a great example of a company that's really trying to promote that understanding of, I'll help you, you help me, let's just help each other. We're all in it to be successful. We're all in it to be profitable. And I love that. And I love the Front Range in Fort Collins and the whole area because of that. And as I said, I've lived all over the world, and I've made my way back to 20 miles from where I was born. And it's because of the people. And I think that we're getting back to an understanding of trying to help each other out and to bring these products to a little bit more of a understanding. And Sad Panda is a fun product. It's something to be spoken about. And as I just took a sip, that slight bitter palate that comes through is very chocolate in essence and very coffee in tone, and it makes it very fun. So I hope you guys enjoy it.
Nicholas, what kind of food goes well with the stout?
Good question. And what I typically see is just things that are going to be charcoal grilled. And so as we put something onto a grill, what you're doing is you're creating carbons that pair well to bitter products like the stout. And so if you have the ability, and the other thing that I've cheated this before because I've lived in locations where I didn't have a grill, but if you have a cast iron pan, you can get those hot temperatures and you can get a good char. And so just a nice char on a piece of food. And so even if we're just doing a steak in a pan, or we're doing a piece of chicken, a good cast iron pan where I can get a nice brown color to the chicken, that brown is going to pair extremely well to the stouts. And this coffee sensation, if I had to give one product, in my favorite opinion, it would be something like a pork butt. And so if you think about how well pork does with coffee and chocolate, this would work extremely well with a pulled pork sandwich or something that has gone through that kind of a process. But yeah, my mouth is actually watering. I'm hungry. It's been a long day, but that does sound good.
A what sandwich?
A pulled pork sandwich.
Oh, heavy pork. Yeah.
Yeah.
Pulled pork.
I'm a fan of, I
Yeah.
like stouts, but I
And
tend
so
to
if
like the oatmeal stouts and chocolate stouts and that kind of thing. So to me, it's more dessert. So I love that piece of it. But I love a fresh off the fire s'more with a stout. So to me, it's like a dessert beer.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And see, the beautiful thing about what you just said is exactly along the lines. What we're doing is you're charring that marshmallow, and that marshmallow becomes, it creates
That's
the
what you
carbons
need to
from
tell
the
me.
sugar, and then the sugar itself is sweet. And I absolutely love that. And the same thing goes with your oatmeal stout. It's a creamy sensation, and that's a fun one. So
my guest here said a breakfast beer. It should go because of the coffee too. So smooth and creamy, so brunch, more brunch, but heavy.
I'm not gonna lie. It's come across my breakfast table before, and it's not a horrible thing, but it's hard to come off of a conversation where I'm talking about moderate consumption and then encouraging drinking a coffee stout for breakfast. So, but yes, it does happen, and there is a lot of things that go quite well with it, and those of course go into the toast with butter and an egg. Just a simple egg over easy with a piece of toast that's got some butter on it. It works well. But again, we'll try not to encourage a coffee stout consumption at 7 in the morning. So maybe think about having your breakfast for dinner, and you can have a nice dinner and have your coffee stout with that. So there's lots of foods. The fun thing about any kind of wine and food pairing, beer and food pairing, spirit and food pairing is that there are lots of answers. There is no exact. And a lot of times people get stuck into thinking, what exactly goes with this? And really, it's all subjective. Each one of us has specific tastes that we like and that we don't like. And we have to learn what it is that works best for each of us. There are guidelines. There are chemical guidelines that I'm happy to talk about. And as we have talked about that, hey, this works well with things that are carbons. But to realize that maybe you might like this with something that is just simple and clean. I've had things like tomato soup that work well with this as well, just because of the viscosity from the tomato soup and things like that. So it's all subjective, and that's the fun thing about it. We've got a million different choices out there, and we just keep tasting along. That's the fun part about it. Any other questions?
Nicholas, I apologize because I just stepped away from. I was just going to say, Nicholas, I just stepped away for a minute. Did you talk at all about ambers, like a fat tire? Did I miss any conversation around that? I would love just your thoughts on the amber ale a little bit too.
Sure. And that's very similar to that Irish ale that we were originally looking at from Max Line Brewery. And so this Irish red is very similar to Fat Tire. And I did mention Fat Tire just off of the global understanding of that product. It has done an exceptional job of making it from Fort Collins, Colorado to everywhere that you can really see it at international airports. So they've done a good job, and the understanding behind it is the same lines. I still have a little in this glass right here. The same lines of understanding how much of a toast we put to the grain. And so as we take that barley and we toast it from a light golden color to a golden color to an amber color, what we're doing is we're increasing the sugars. And those sugars can be converted into alcohol, or they can be left behind to become just a little bit sweet. Things like that Newcastle that I was talking about being a brown ale, where it has, if you're familiar with Newcastle, it's kind of a sweeter beer. And it's because what they do is they toast the grain to that color, and then instead of fermenting it to 6.5%, 7% alcohol, they only ferment it to 5% alcohol, and they leave behind a little bit of those residual sugars. Fat tire is similar to that, only it's not going to be quite as sweet, but it has that thickness, it has that concentration, and then it just has, more than anything, the color from the toast on the grain. So, and I know there's a lot of Fat Tire fans out there. It's a wonderful product, and it's done a great job of showcasing what a microbrewery can do. I do know that that New Belgium is merging soon. And their sellout of what they've been doing is it angers some Fort Collins, Coloradoans, but at the end of the day, they've expanded their global market, and that's a wonderful thing to think of. A mom and pop shop going from making some microbrews to being an international world-class product. They have to make those steps along the way, and it is what it is. And though it's sad to think of my tiny little Fort Collins brewery becoming something that's kind of an international conglomerate, good for them, and I'm proud of them. I mean, that's an American dream right there. And a lot of the Coloradoans that are more into the microbrews and support those smaller companies, you got to realize that New Belgium was a small company, and they just did well enough to become a big company. So it's great to see that, and I'm a huge Fat Tire fan. So
Okay,
anybody else, you guys happy with our tasting?
Can I make a quick comment that everyone might be interested in that's in the Zoom? First of all, thanks, Nick, it was outstanding, your presentation and what we learned.
My pleasure.
I've got a February 13th Associated Press article in front of me that says that in Egypt, archaeologists discovered and unearthed an ancient beer factory from 3150 to 2613 BC, 12 to 13 centuries before Moses. So
pretty awesome.
We go back a long way.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And it's amazing to see that progression. We teach actually 3 different history classes at the college that I teach at, and we go from ancient to medieval to modern understandings of the progression of history of alcoholic beverages. And looking at the ancient understandings, we still don't have all of the understanding, and we keep discovering different archaeological discoveries that are giving us an understanding of how old some of these products are. And it's so much fun to see and to hear, and I love that you found that, because as we'll continue to see throughout history, the more that we understand it, my favorite thing about it is that these kinds of products have outlived every civilization on the planet. From the different ales and the stouts and the wines and well, we won't go into spirits, but ales and stouts and wines, from the ancient Chinese to the three dynasties of the Egyptians that have come and gone and collapsed, all of these products have continued to progress through the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, more than likely all the civilizations that are continuing today. And as we continue to look at these products, this is real history. And paying attention to how these have affected different cultures is why I got into the industry in the first place. I absolutely am fascinated to see how a specific culture picks up on product and makes it into their own. And the ability for me to be able to travel and to go to these places and to learn that, hey, you know, they were making it this way then, and they're now making it this way now, and these people picked it up that way. That's one of the most fascinating subjects to me in the world, and it's been a pleasure to study it, and I hope to continue it for many years. But I greatly appreciate you guys all listening to me, and I hope you did learn something and get something out of this. I am always happy to have Balfour hosting me, and as I said, I'm now vaccinated, and I'll be teaching in person. And so with that, hopefully I'll see some of your smiling faces. Young lady, I see another
Nick,
question.
I got a burning question, because I know you've done so many of these tastings on our Louisville campus. So I think you understand the palate of our residents there in Louisville. So if you had to pick a beer that exemplifies Balfour Louisville, what would it be?
You know, it's that's a difficult question, just because there's so many different styles, but if I was to try and come up with a good understanding, I really would give something along that Golden Belgian Strong Ale as a strong backbone, a strong understanding of Colorado tradition, and that golden crisp yet still tasty. You know, I talked a little bit about Pilsners kind of being light and refreshing and not lingering on the palate. And as we look at something like this, it's got backbone, it's got structure, it has taste, it has the uniqueness of a microbrewery.
Are you talking about the beer, or are you talking about the people?
I think I'm going to go both on that. I think that both have the structure and the balance and the appreciation and the appeal. And so, you know, if I gotta group people into a specific style, I'll go with the Belgian Strong Ale on that one.
That's great. Can you tell I'm in charge of marketing for Balfour?
Go for it. That's great.
That's great.
Thanks, Nicholas. That was
very good.
awesome.
Well, is everybody happy?
I would love to ask one question before we go, and that is sour beers. How do sour beers
I love them.
kind of tie in? Because from everything that I've heard, you've talked about, you know, different levels of toasting in the grain, and are sour beers even the same thing?
They are. Their original production is called a Flemish sour, and they're Belgium in historic understanding. And so as we look at the progression of history, a sour beer of today, we got a lot of them, and I'm thankful for it. I'm a huge sour beer fan. But the original sour beer comes from Belgium, and it actually comes from a specific monastery. It's called Duchess de Bourgogne. And Duchess de Bourgogne has been producing sour Flemish ales since the 1400s. And most sour ales have a fruit to them. And that fruit will be brought to almost vinegar form. And so as we look at wine production, or if we look at any kind of fruit that goes through fermentation, at a specific point, the acidity level gets to what we would classify as vinegar. And that understanding, that acid structure that comes from the production, is either implemented during the fermentation or added after, which then makes a Flemish sour or a sour styled ale. Souring is nothing other than increasing the acid structure. And as we look at these beers and these lagers and these stouts and these porters and the ales, most of the time their acid concentration is very low. And if there is acid to it, it's called lactic acid. And lactic acid is very creamy and fresh. Citric acid and malic acid are acids that are present in things like lemons and limes and tangerines and Granny Smith apples and pears. And those are sour acids. Those kinds of acidities are created in the sour mash process, which gives us our sour beers. I'm glad you asked that, because it is a completely different avenue. It's one that's expanding, and the amount of flavors and the things that they're doing with sour ales is absolutely great. It's fun to see. I like that. There's cucumber sour ales out there that in the summertime are dangerous. Absolutely delicious.
Yeah, I've had hibiscus sours or raspberry sours, and it's just fascinating.
It's fun. They're fun. And that acid concentration, especially for someone like me that crosses the boundary between the wines and the beers and the spirits, it can give you a little bit more of a light, refreshing wine sensation versus the heavier cereal grain sensation that comes from a lot of the stouts and the porters and things like that. So I appreciate that question, because it's something that's important, and it's a wonderful category. It is also a category that's hit or miss. I typically, when pouring sours, will get people that really like them or think they are not good at all. And that is, you know, we'll get that with lots of different products that are out there, especially in the alcoholic industry. And there's plenty of different interesting products. But sour beers, along with like a good oaky scotch or a peaty scotch, either you love it or it's not for you. And so that one's always an interesting category. Everybody happy?
Yeah, that was great,
Good.
Nicholas. Thank you
Well,
very much.
my pleasure, you guys. If there's anything that I can do for you or answer any other questions, and if not, I'll let you find folks be and enjoy your beers, and we'll see you find folks from Balfour here in the next couple of months.
And Stephen, we'll make sure to get you some beer down in Pueblo. We have some, so we'll make sure we get some down your way.
Your Pueblo
Great.
connection.
Well, cheers, and I appreciate it.
Yes, thanks everybody.
Thank you all
guys.
for being
John, we'll
here.
see you guys soon.
This goes.